her, it was like her 18-year-old father was like flinched the guy. He just didn't want to. I don't think an 18-year-old in a family could play. In that family, you're a bunch of crackers. That's different. What we're talking about is her attributing blame to her 18-year-old. He just went along with the crowd. I mean, it was his grandfather and his father. He didn't have a choice. Anyway, you and I didn't talk. Hello, Vince. Ready?
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. And welcome to today's colloquium. And we're excited to hear Mafaz Al-Suwaidan's presentation. She will be introduced by Vincent Brown, who actually needs no introduction, but I'll say a few words. He is Charles Warren Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies. His teaching and research specializations are in Atlantic history, African diaspora studies, and the history of slavery in the Americas. Professor Brown's works include the highly regarded and much acclaimed books, The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, and Tacky's Revolt, The Story of an Atlantic Slave War. He is also the producer of Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness, an audiovisual documentary broadcast on the PBS series Independent Lens, and the short video series The Bigger Picture for PBS Digital Studios. Please welcome Professor Vincent Brown.
Thank you, Krishna, and thank all of you for coming out this afternoon. I think this is going to be a fantastic, fantastic talk because we are here to hear from Mafaz Al-Suwaidan, who is a doctoral candidate and prize fellow in philosophy of religion at Harvard University's Committee on the Study of Religion with a secondary degree in African and African American Studies, and she's my friend. So I'm really pleased to be introducing her. She holds a Master's of Theological Study degree in Islamic Studies, a Master of Fine Arts degree in Creative Writing, and a Bachelor of Journalism. Her research interests include modern Islamic thought in a transnational context, Afro-diasporic political thought, West African Sufism, race and gender in Muslim societies, early Islamic history, and religion in literature. Her dissertation explores the religious thought and philosophies of early 20th century Muslim social political movements in Egypt, Senegal, and the United States, reconstructing and reconsidering key elements of their thinking against the backdrop of Western liberalism. Mafaz has a keen interest in education, both inside and outside the traditional classroom. She's taught at the graduate and undergraduate levels at Northeastern University and Harvard, receiving the Harvard University Certificate of Distinction in Teaching. She has served as a facilitator for intercultural dialogue at the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations Conference and as a program coordinator for the World in Conversation Center for Public Diplomacy at Pennsylvania State University. She's committed, most of all, to making education accessible beyond the classroom and in the public sphere. In the local community, she has led several Islamic studies circles and volunteers to teach weekly classes at a Massachusetts state prison since 2018. Online, she founded a global Arabic-speaking women's book club where women from all walks of life, from professors to stay-at-home mothers, get the opportunity to engage in live conversations with the authors they read. She's worked on several media projects. Most recently, she was the senior producer and writer of American Muslims, a landmark series of short documentary films that reveal and explore the untold histories of Muslims in the United States. And can I just put in a small plug? That has been nominated for a Webby Award. So I hope you will all go online to the Webbies and vote for American Muslims as your favorite web-produced series of the year. Thank you in advance. She has also worked in training and consultation capacity with a broad range of organizations, including museums, churches, gaming companies, and innovation labs on topics relating to race, religion, and social activism. Next year, she will join Yale Law School as a fellow in their program in Islamic law and civilizations. You're hissing your alma mater?
A long time ago.
You know they have a Henry Louis Gates lecture at Yale, an endowed lecture at Yale, and he's hissing the place that has a Henry Louis Gates endowed lecture.
All right, I take it back.
Mafaz will speak to us today on Muslim countercultures from Medina to Bed-Stuy. Please welcome her to the podium.
Yes, thank you so much, Vince.
Can you send us a link when it's Webby time?
Yeah, I'll make sure to do that. Thank you. Okay, thank you all for being here. Thank you to Professor Vincent Brown for introducing me. I met Professor Vince Brown years ago now, and it is true, we've become good friends, and to have this kind of mentorship is, I know, something very, very hard to come by. So thank you for everything. Thank you to Professor Henry Louis Gates for being a source of encouragement and support for me. I don't know if you know this, but there were several moments where you said to me, you're a good writer, just write. Stop thinking, just write. And so whenever I face a blank page, I often hear your voice in my ear saying that. So thank you so much, and thank you for standing by my side during difficult times as well. So thank you. Thank you to the Hutchins Center, Abby, Krishna, everyone here, to Transition Magazine, Tanya in particular, for giving me a shot. I feel like I took advantage of everything at the Hutchins. I published in Transition, I talked to all the librarians, and so this has been a really wonderful year. Thank you to my fellows.
So that's why you leave nothing left.
I've done it. I've taken it all. And thank you to my friends and family in the audience. Okay, so I will make one request before we begin, which is that I have a lot to cover. So any questions or comments you have, I ask to hold to the end, and then we can get to them at that point. Also, I want to just give a quick shout out to Professor Layla Ahmed, who's here. Yes. Professor Ahmed was the reason why I pursued any kind of graduate work, the reason why I started this particular project. And I'm just so honored that you would be here to see me present some of it. And also, a member of my committee is here, Terrence Sevilla, so thank you for being here as well. Okay, so initially I had intended on presenting my dissertation work at this colloquium, but I've actually decided to take another route and do a sort of two-part presentation. The first part is going to draw on my dissertation work and provide some context for part two, and then in part two I'll be reading from my essay titled Ziyara in Harlem, Sufis, Senegal, and the Schomburg, which will be published in the next issue of Transition magazine. So it's going to be sort of half academic, half personal literary essay. The term, I'll start with letting you know what the plan is. So the plan is I'm going to give this introduction with talking about the broader project and some theory, do a longue durée and immediate context to set the context of the stories that I'm going to tell, and then we'll get into the Transition magazine for the contemporary connections. The term counterculture tends to evoke images of punk rockers and speakeasies, burning bras and psychedelic trips, underground meetings and radical comics. Rarely, if ever, do Islamist study circles, study groups, disciplined Sufi practices, or Black nationalist Muslim publications come to mind. Yet in their defiance of a dominant mainstream and pursuit of self-actualization through alternative means, whether that is expressed through thought, dress, art, or otherwise, movements that perform and produce the examples above are as counterculture as they come. What I think is also distinctive about countercultures, as opposed to, say, like hermits living in the mountains, is that they're doing this while remaining engaged with the mainstream. Before we go on, I'm going to just give 3 or 4 very quick definitions that I think will be helpful for us as I introduce the groups that I study. The first is a definition of Sufism. So Sufism is often mischaracterized as a mystical offshoot or sect of Islam. Sufism is in fact a way or a path that is rooted deeply within the Islamic tradition across all sects. It emphasizes cultivating a connection with the divine through self-purification, deep study of esoteric truths, and disciplined asceticism. So this is what I mean when I say Sufism. Islamism. So all of these words are kind of loaded and also very loosey-goosey sometimes. Islamism has been used to describe everything from ISIS and Al-Qaeda to the Nahda movement in Tunis, to political parties across the Muslim world. I think that a useful way of thinking about Islamists are people or groups that are active in social and political activities and who return to Islam, namely the Quran, the Sunnah, the Sharia, Islamic divine law, as their ultimate moral reference. So this is what I mean when I say Islamism. The third is secularism. Again, another concept that's really very difficult to define. I sort of follow Talal Asad in his definition of secularism, which is to say that definitions are really historically situated, should be situated in their historical context. So in the way that I'm using secularism, we'll think of it as a rearrangement of the relationship of people and authority. So often when people say secularism, they think separation of church and state, this like strong break between religion and politics. But I'd rather think of it as this rearrangement between people and authority. And it limits the role of religious authority, placing it under the authority of a governing power. But it doesn't really just stop at that. It's also sort of an orientation of sensibilities that defers to rationalism, often quantitative and empirical rationalism, and privileges direct sensory experience. The fourth is liberalism. So if you've read anything at all, any even passing piece on liberalism, you'll find that it's really difficult to define liberalism. What I'll make it clear here is I'm not talking about the classical theories of liberalism. I'm talking about the liberalism that emerges in the interwar period. I like the definition that Sarah Marusek gives. So she says, by liberalism, I mean the Western political and economic project envisioning abstract individuals who have rights and are guided primarily by what is identified as instrumental rationality. So here you see how it's connected to secularism, rather than sort of religious or moral rationality, with intervention from the state to regulate the system. So this is what I mean when I'll refer to liberalism. My work is a study of the thought of 3 20th century Muslim political and social movements that emerged as, I would like to claim, countercultures to modern secular liberalism. Both the secular liberalism of the governing dominant or colonial powers under which they lived, and that of contemporaneous anti-colonial movements in their immediate locale. For the Muslim Brothers, those contemporaneous movements would be primarily the Free Officers Movement, which is exemplified by the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser. For the Tijaniya, it would be the Bloc Démocratique Sénégalais, exemplified by Léopold Sédar Senghor. And for the Nation of Islam, it's the broader civil rights movement, really exemplified by the leaders of the NAACP. Jama'at al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Order of the Muslim Brothers, more commonly known as, yeah. Jama'at al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Order of the Muslim Brothers, more colloquially known as the Muslim Brotherhood, was founded by Hassan al-Banna in Ismailia, Egypt in 1928. Jama'at al-Fayda al-Tijaniya, the Order of the Divine Flood, is a Tijani Sufi order, and it was founded in 1929 by Ibrahim Niass outside Kaolack, Senegal. And the Nation of Islam was founded in 1930 by Wallace Farad Muhammad in Detroit, Michigan. Established in 3 consecutive years in the middle of the interwar period, each of these movements led large-scale social mobilization efforts, published considerable amounts of literature, and attempted participation in local politics. All 3 challenged the societies in which they functioned, as well as the twin pillars of the emerging post-war world order, secularization and political liberalism. All 3 movements sought to reinvent their communities by religious means, politically empowering dispossessed people through theological convictions. There is no indication of any significant or sustained interaction between the movements as founders or early leadership, But due to exilic persecution, the Muslim Brothers, migration for the Divine Flood, and organizational dispersal for the Nation of Islam, all three movements would eventually meet in the urban centers of the United States in the 1970s. The manifestations of counterculturalism naturally vary among the three groups. However, their shared historical context, the interwar era, years that immediately preceded formal decolonization in Asia and Africa, constitutes a unifying framework, a common sort of meta-mainstream to which they were all responding. While the three groups overlap ostensibly in their connections to Islam and Africa, they intersect more substantially in their relationship to this shared geopolitical context, as well as in their strong religious orientations, their structured group formations, explicit political activity, and in their appeal to revival narratives. These groups are often differentiated from one another through their respective classifications as Islamist and Arab for the Muslim Brothers, Sufi and African for the Divine Flood, and Black nationalist and American for the Nation of Islam. But I argue that these designations can actually obscure much more than they reveal. Appearing in 3 consecutive years, all three groups are self-avowedly Muslim, modern, and revivalist, holding visions of a utopian transnational community of adherents and allies. In a mid-century setting, when alliances among global powers were being torn apart and reassembled toward variant grand visions of how the world ought to be ordered, within an emerging liberal world order, the significance of these three groups' intersecting qualities, their attempts to fashion assemblies and visions of their own, and the responses that they generate from both the colonialist states and the anti-colonialist opponents are worth exploring. On the rare occasion that religious movements, Muslim or otherwise, are cited as examples of countercultures to secular liberalism, they're painted with a very broad brush and portrayed as fundamentalists who hearken back to a traditionalist ideal. Rarely, if ever, are they considered innovators, formulating an imminent critique of their epoch. By confining modern religious movements to the role of fundamentalists, the proponents of secular liberalism are able to completely dismiss them as these sort of outer cultures, representatives of an alien way of life perceived as entirely weird, different, or other. By reframing these movements as countercultures to modern secular liberalism, one must contend with the fact that they are not only reactions to modernity, secularism, and political liberalism, but they are also deeply shaped by them. And this gets us to a discussion around the relationship between religion and secularism. So the position that secularism is not a break from or absence of religion, but rather a formation shaped in the image of religion, is one that has gained wide acceptance within the study of religion. These are people like Talal Asad, Charles Taylor, Joan Scott, who have written about this. Debates persist over whether or not secularism operates as a veil for a particular religion, namely Protestant Christianity, but the foundational premise that the sacred and the secular depend on each other remains intact. By considering these religious groups' thought and activities as imminent critiques of modern secular liberalism, I'm suggesting that we've entered a new round of this cyclical and reciprocal definition making. With the rise and consolidation of the modern secular nation-state as the inescapable central domain of human life, it is crucial to understand or to consider how religion might now be shaped in the image of the modern secular. This is not to say that if the mask of modern religious thought and practice were torn off, secularism would rear its head, but rather that this dialectic remains at play. In Formations of the Secular, Talal Asad writes, I take the view, as others have done, that the religious and the secular are not essentially fixed categories. However, I do not claim that if one stripped appearances, one would see that some apparently secular institutions were really religious. I assume, on the contrary, that there is nothing essentially religious, nor any universal essence that defines sacred language or sacred experience. But I also assume that there were breaks between Christian and secular life, in which words and practices were rearranged and new discursive grammars replaced previous ones. I suggest that the fuller implications of those shifts need to be explored. I simply want to get away from the idea that the secular is a mask for religion that secular political practices simulate religious ones. My work is not a study of religious practices simulating secular political practices. Rather, it is a response to Assad's call to explore the fuller implications of the shifting discursive grammars between the two, while also accounting for the distinctive case of religious secular political practices. Years ago, I had a passing conversation with a young member of the Moroccan Muslim Brothers adjacent Harakat al-Tawheed wal-Islah, the movement for reform and unity. At some point, I asked him about his political commitments. He responded, "I am a secular Islamist." Similarly, the late Egyptian literary thinker and scholar Abdul Wahab al-Masiri, a former member of the Muslim Brothers who remained sympathetic to the movement throughout his life, devoted a significant amount of attention in his work to developing the concept of an Islamic humanism. He built his thought on the works of figures like Islamic thinker and first president of the Independent Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Ali Izzat Begovic. Such examples and the broader arguments of this dissertation reveal that the age of thinking about religious responses to secularism as mere calcified relics of an idolized past, wielded in protest against the ills of the present, is over. Scholars of both religion and secularism must grapple with the synthesis embodied by groups like the Muslim Brothers, the Divine Flood, and the NOI that emerge as a result of the historical contradictions, material, economic, and social, that were heightened by World War I, the interwar period, disappointments around nationalist efforts at decolonization, and unequal integration. In my larger project, I begin by posing the question, what made these socially active, politically engaged religious groups possible as social, political, and religious phenomena in the interwar period? I go through and offer a brief overview of the immediate local conditions that influenced the early lives of the group's founders, or in the case of the Nation of Islam, of Elijah Muhammad, the group's main leader, as well as the longue durée of colonialism and of the collapse of Islamic economic, educational, and religious institutions that shaped the power dynamics of the emerging Muslim world. In this presentation, though, I'm just going to give snapshots into the longue durée of colonialism and some of the immediate conditions that made these groups possible. So we'll get into the longue durée of colonialism. Most scholarship on the longue durée of secularism and liberalism begin in the 17th century, with the Peace of Westphalia and the writings of Thomas Hobbes. This, I argue, is a convenient framing as it circumvents serious engagement with the Muslim and Jewish other, an apparition of the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition, limiting the discourse on religious freedom and tolerance to an intra-European Christian question. Instead, I would like to suggest that we should actually begin in the 15th century to include Portuguese, Mediterranean, and Atlantic commercial expansion, the fall of Islamic Granada, the Spanish-funded expeditions and colonization of the Americas, and the early transatlantic slave trade. By doing so, we can connect the accounts of the longue durée of secularism and liberalism to, very importantly, the longue durée of colonialism. Historian Gerald Horne captures both the importance and the challenge of shifting the timeline of a well-known story backward in his writing on the long 16th century. He says, although, as noted, I posit that 1492 is the hinge moment in the rise of Western Europe, I also argue in these pages that it is important to sketch the years before this turning point, especially since it was 1453, the Ottoman Turks seizing Constantinople, today's Istanbul, that played a critical role in spurring Columbus's voyage. And of course, there were other trends that led to 1453, and so on, we march backward in time. I too am tempted to march backward in time. However, I think that Horne is right that we need to begin at least in the 15th century. Writing on Islam, the Mediterranean, and the rise of capitalism, Jairus Banaji, who my dear friend Swarnab Ghosh has written a wonderful paper on that you should all read, in his work, he focuses on the 12th to the 15th centuries as the period of the growth of capitalism in Europe that preceded the industrial era of company capitalism, marked by more brutal methods of accumulation and competition. Like Rodel, he traces early forms of European capitalism to Genoese and then Portuguese commercial expansion and plundering. However, Banaji goes a step further. By factoring in the role of the Crusades as a plundering enterprise that fueled the rise of European capitalism. He writes, Thus, Islam made a powerful contribution to the growth of capitalism in the Mediterranean, in part because it preserved and expanded the monetary economy of late antiquity and innovated business techniques that became the staple of Mediterranean commerce, in particular partnerships and commenda agreements, and also because the seaports of the Muslim world became a rich source of the plundered money capital, which largely financed the growth of maritime capitalism in Europe. Indeed, Mendel stated this with unabashed bluntness when he wrote, "The accumulation of money capital by the Italian merchants who dominated European economic life from the 11th to the 15th century originated directly from the Crusades, an enormous plundering enterprise if there ever was one." Even astute Middle East historians like William L. Cleveland and Martin Bunton overlook the importance of this plunder in their magisterial work, A History of the Modern Middle East. In their section on the 11th and 15th centuries, they write, "Except for sparking a spirit of resistance and cooperation among rulers in Syria and Egypt, whose combined efforts led to the Crusaders' defeat, the Crusades had a minimal influence. Thereby, they completely overlook the profound economic impact of the Crusades. This history of medieval era assaults on what Banaji calls Islamic commercial supremacy must be accounted for as a precursor to later colonial projects through which Europe came to dominate much of what we would eventually know as the Third World." Though infamous for being the empire on which the sun never sets, the British Empire emerged on the heels of these earlier Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish colonial exploits, whose rise depended heavily on their economic and military encounter with Islam. Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa once wrote, "Politics and not navigation is the English contribution to the substance of civilization. England found the sea only after it was told where it was." The success of the English colonies in North America and the West Indies was only made possible by these earlier Spanish-funded incursions into the continent and the Caribbean islands, along with the expansion of Portuguese trade posts in Africa, which facilitated the large-scale transatlantic slave trade. This brutal system of exploitation and expropriation and dispossession created the material base of European settler economies in the Americas, built upon the bones of a near-exterminated indigenous population and the blood of kidnapped, imported, and forced African labor. What is often left out of this story, however, is that before the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, Ottoman Istanbul, I apologize, I lost my place. Just get back to it. Okay. What is often left out of the story, however, is that before the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, Ottoman Istanbul had become Europe's largest city by the late 1500s, with a population exceeding 700,000. Additionally, besides being a supreme maritime power, the Ottoman military made massive improvements to its land army, making it the most formidable military force of the 16th and 17th centuries. This is important to note because, as Horn puts it, quote, "Western Europe's contestation with the Ottomans was a precondition of the rise of plundering of the Americas and Africa." Horn goes as far as to say that Pope Nicholas V's 1452 Dum Diversas papal bull, which authorized the enslavement of non-Christians into perpetual servitude, was an extension of the Catholic Crusades against Islam. He argues, quote, "A pan-European Christian campaign against Islam extended to a campaign against non-European, non-Christians, especially in the Americas and Africa. Arguably, this pan-European initiative was a prelude to the rise of the similarly devastating, quote, whiteness project," end quote. Thus, the colonial duet of race and capital proves, once again, to be inseparable from its theological tempo. Between the Crusades and the peak of Ottoman military economic prowess, however, was the fall of Islamic Granada. Emir Muhammad XII surrendered the city to Isabella and Ferdinand on January 2nd, 1492, ending about 780 years of Muslim rule on the Iberian Peninsula. Among those present at the siege of Granada was Genoese seafarer and merchant Christopher Columbus. In the first entry of his August 1492 voyage journal, Columbus describes being in Granada and witnessing the royal Castilian banners, quote, planted by force upon the towers of Alhambra, and the Moorish king emerging from the city gates to kiss the hands of the Catholic monarchs. So just a quick historical note here, there's a lot of controversy around Columbus's voyage journals, whether they're authentic or not, and historians have gone back and forth in this discussion. Either way, I think that what we're about to read from his voyage journals, even if we take it as complete fiction, the historical realities are still confirmed in other places. So I think it's still worth reading. After outlining some of his missionary objectives in India, he reveals his understanding of the function of his colonial mission, framing it within the explicitly anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish context of his endeavor. He writes, "Your Highnesses, as Catholic Christians and princes who love and promote the holy Christian faith and are enemies of the doctrine of Muhammad and of all idolatry and heresy, determined to send me, Christopher Columbus, to the above-mentioned countries of India, to see the said princes, people, and territories, and to learn their disposition and the proper method of converting them to our holy faith. And furthermore, directed that I should not proceed by land to the east, as is customary, but by a westerly route, in which direction we have hitherto no certain evidence that anyone has gone. So after having expelled the Jews from your dominions, your Highnesses, in the same month of January, ordered me to proceed with a sufficient armament to the said regions of India, and for that purpose granted me great favors and ennobled me, that thenceforth I might call myself Don, and be High Admiral of the Sea, and perpetual Viceroy and Governor in all the islands and continents which I might discover and acquire." He was instructed not to proceed to the east, of course, due to Ottoman expansion, which we saw earlier, and Mamluk dominance over key port regions in Greater Syria and Egypt. Historian Abbas Hamdani writes that the Mamluks had held such control over Red Sea trade that Sultan Ashraf Barsbey was able to institute a monopoly over the sugar trade and impose such transit dues and currency restrictions on the European trade with the Orient that protests began to be expressed by the Italian maritime city-states. The economic significance of Columbus possibly finding another way to penetrate Eastern trade routes, especially in China and Central Asia, cannot be understated. As Hamdani writes, should a new trade route to the East be found, it could make Christian Europe economically independent of the Muslim Middle East. Indeed, some speculated a trade blockade of the Middle East might well produce the economic strangulation and eventual political fall of the Muslim countries, thus liberating Jerusalem and opening up the Middle East once again to the Crusades and colonization. While some works exploring the connections between Columbus's journey and Catholic anti-Muslim fervor, for example, Nelson Maldonado Torres does this in his work, I think they focus on theological and ontological constructions of a Muslim other a little bit too much, and this approach risks overemphasizing the ideological at the expense of the socio-historical and material realities. Iskandar Abbasi offers a compelling critique of this tendency, arguing that greater attention ought to be paid to the material and the epistemic effects of global power relations and how theories of ontological exclusion were applied materially. But I think we can go even further and ask, how were these theories of ontological exclusion produced materially, not just applied materially? On October 12, Columbus landed on the shores of the Bahamas. On October 28, he reached Cuba. On December 6, he landed on the shores of Haiti, renaming it Hispaniola before embarking on an arduous return voyage to Spain. Thus, the destinies of Granada, the West Indies, and the fates of Muslims and Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, as well as the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, have always been inextricably connected. In a scene from the first novel of her acclaimed Granada trilogy that was published in 1994 to 1995, Egyptian writer and the first known Arab to have received a PhD in African American literature in the US, Radwa Ashur, offers a glimpse into this deep entanglement. Told from the perspective of the Muslim inhabitants of the city in the aftermath of its fall, Ashur depicts Columbus's return from his voyage, parading his plunder of gold and specimens of plants, animals, and people in a grand procession through the fallen city. The scene has the voices of two Muslim children from Granada, Salima and Saad. Ashur writes, "The marvels had not yet ended when the captives came. At the end of the parade, whispers moved through the crowd. The people from the country, they're the people from that country, the people who live in the New World. They walked with deliberate steps, hands tied behind their backs and surrounded by guards on both sides. They had fine features and thin bodies, not without a certain frailty. The men as well as the women had long, straight black hair that hung down and covered their shoulders. In spite of the Castilian clothes they wore, the difference was clear and obvious. From their features, or the look in their eyes, or the colored feathers fixed in bands around their heads. Their appearance was strange, but it didn't arouse aversion, rather the opposite entirely. Perhaps because of the beauty of their faces, or the elegance of their stature, or for some other reason. Still, some of the Castilians were laughing at them. Salima looked at Saad and asked, 'What's making them laugh?' 'I don't know.' The laughter had surprised Saad and embarrassed him. Then it annoyed him. The four children didn't know what had happened to the cheer that had leapt in their hearts. They had not noticed it disappear, nor had they noticed a touch of sadness settle over the parade and in their eyes. In silence, they watched the hands tied behind backs, the slow steps, the bent heads, and the look that surprised you when one of them lifted their eyes and stared at you as you stared at them. Salima said, 'Why don't we go home?' They went silently along the mountain roads where the sun had gone down and the colors on the hills had blurred and then been extinguished, surrendering to the impending night. Saad still stared at the parade of prisoners that had passed. Had they besieged them from land and sea, he wondered, as they had the people of Malaga? Had they starved them until those who dared ate the flesh of their horses? Had they shelled their houses, burst into them, and led the people away as captives? In this fictional scene, Ashur captures not only the fact of Columbus's parade as a spectacle of one conquest layered upon another, the colonization of the Caribbean upon the Reconquista, but also the sense of recognition between the captives of the Caribbean and the besieged of Granada. Immediately preceding the cited passage, the children watch attentively as Columbus's troop carries birds, plants, and fruits, the likes of which they had never seen. The Castilians around them cry out, "Long live Christopher Columbus! Long live Christopher Columbus!" To which Salima, the little girl, responds defiantly, "It's not a new world, it's just a different world. That's all there is to it." The scene is instructive in highlighting not only the entanglement of the predicaments of the conquered at this pivotal historical conjuncture, but the possibility of their defiance as well. Later in the scene, one of the indigenous Caribbean captives, a girl, trips and falls to the ground. One of the guards tried to help her stand up, writes Ashur, but she pushed him away with her shoulder and managed to stand up on her own and go on walking, even though her hands were tied. This is a picture of Radu Ashur, and this is her with her husband, Murid Barghouti, the great Palestinian poet. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about the immediate context. If we were to render modern history into a neatly segmented If we were to render modern history into a neatly segmented timeline, the years 1917 to 1919 ought to be marked in bold, red, and perforated lines. Of course, we have the Bolshevik Revolution, the defeat of the Ottomans in Palestine. Woodrow Wilson comes out with the doctrine of self-determination, the Treaty of Versailles, and all of this with the backdrop of the Spanish flu, which took the lives of 50 million people, I think, worldwide. And so, a lot was going on during just those 3 years. For the locales in which our protagonists were born, the end of those years, 1919, marked events of particularly vigorous and long-lasting impact. Senegal was managing an outbreak of the bubonic plague that was raising simmering disputes between local Muslim populations and French colonial administrators to a boil. Labor strikes and nationalist protests were erupting in Egypt as the anti-colonial revolution of 1919 caught fire. And the United States was greeting its black veterans returning from the bloody fronts of World War I with racial terror, lynching, and the Red Summer of 1919. Far too often, scholarship on the early histories and thought of the Muslim Brothers, the Divine Flood, and the Nation of Islam overlooks the global dimensions of the formation and development of these movements, casting them as eminently local until their popularity reaches a tipping point. In my work, I present brief vignettes of the early lives of the three leaders that highlight the cosmopolitanism of their youth. And though certainly not exhaustive, these examples provide insight into the contexts that shaped the emergence and growth of their respective movements. This is where you see my Vincent Brown coming through. In his work on enslaved Africans in the 18th century Caribbean, Julius Scott argues that maritime mobility increased waterside populations' exposure to global news, novel ideas, and communication networks. He writes, "The movement of ships and seamen not only offered opportunities for developing skills or escaping, but provided the medium of long-distance communication and allowed interested Afro-Americans to follow developments in other parts of the world." It is perhaps worth noting then, that the stories of the Muslim Brothers, the Divine Flood, and the NOI all begin along the banks of three rivers, the Saloum, the Nile, and the Detroit. Three pathways with the power to extend small hometowns beyond their borders, linking them to global trade, news circulation, and networks of intellectual and cultural exchange. Here, I'm going to give a brief vignette of the life of Ibrahim Niasse, which will push us into the next section on the essay. So born at the turn of the century, 1900, the founder of Al-Fayda Tijaniya, Ibrahim Niasse, was 19 years old and living in Kaolack, Senegal. Born in a village, this is in the year 1919, born in a village just outside Kaolack, Niasse spent the early years of his life with his family in the British Gambia, where his father, Abdullah Niasse, was in exile until 1911. Upon his return to Kaolack, the elder Niasse, who was a scholar of high standing within the Tijaniya order, set up a Sufi Zawiya, and that's a sort of community center where people can learn, study, worship, and even live sometimes. He set it up near his home, and as Rudiger Siesemann writes, the area soon became a busy hub of distinguished Tijani visitors. It is within this bustling environment of knowledge-seeking and spiritual networks that Ibrahim Niasse gained his reputation as a young scholar of singular virtuosity. Anglophone histories of the early 20th century Senegal bear the unfortunate tendency of focusing on two main features: the conscription, deployment, and subsequent return of Senegalese soldiers who served under the French army in World War I, and Blaise Diane's political crusade to grant Senegalese inhabitants of the four communes full French citizenship. Reading those histories, one might be excused in thinking that nothing of note was happening outside the four communes and outside the epistemic and political authority of the French colonial administration. Meanwhile, as Zachary Wright demonstrates, Abdullah Niasse, Ibrahim Niasse's father, and the scholars of his generation, notably Malik Sy and Amadou Bamba, were establishing advanced learning communities where students and teachers of all backgrounds were coming and going from various parts of West Africa and North Africa. These scholars also did not limit their lives to the pursuit of knowledge alone, but also took on activities in agriculture and trade for sustenance and to provide for their quarters. As Siesemann writes, Ibrahim's father, Abdullah Niasse, had been one of the pioneers of peanut cultivation as a cash crop in the area. When Ibrahim inherited part of those holdings after his father's death, he continued the tradition of tilling the land and eventually helped to found Kaolack's first agricultural cooperative in 1947 to protect the rights of peasant farmers. So by the time Ibrahim Niasse claimed to be the bringer of the flood, of the Divine Flood, which we'll talk about in the essay, his exposure to the world extended far beyond the texts that he studies as part of his religious and spiritual cultivation. His practical knowledge of local demographics, agricultural production and trade, diplomatic relations with local and colonial authorities, and networks of intellectual exchange had well prepared him for establishing his own Sufi center in what would come to be known as Medina Bai in 1930. This is Medina Bai today. Okay, so I threw a lot of history at you with this larger context in mind and some of this immediate context. Let's get into part two. And in the second part, I sort of hope to show how the counterculturalism of the Tijaniya manifests today through the rituals, the transnational connections, and the unexpected reverse migrations taken by the movement's African-American disciples. So as I mentioned previously, Sufism is often mischaracterized as its own sect of Islam, but it really is important to understand that it's not. It's a way that is deeply rooted within the Islamic tradition. Before I get into it, I just want to point to this very quickly, this quote by Hajja Naja Abdus-Salam. And Hajja Naja Abdus-Salam is an Afro-Puerto Rican American. And she says, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, because of Sheikh Hassan, who is a sheikh in the Tijani order, I was able to return home to the motherland, not as a guest or a tourist, but to reconnect with my ancestry through the history, my history through Gori Island and Medina Bay. So return to Sufism. Sufism is a fundamental component of the tripartite system that defines Islamic devotional practice. First, we have the Sharia, the divine law. Then we have the Haqiqa, the ultimate reality. And the third is the Tariqa, the way. The Sharia is intended to guide a Muslim's external affairs. The Haqiqa aims to enhance their consciousness. And the Tariqa focuses on refining their inner realities through knowledge and practice. The Arabic word for Sufi order is simply this one, Tariqa. It means path or way. Okay, now I'm going to give myself a little break and I'm going to show you a video. In this video, this video shows how some of these concepts have entered American popular culture. This scene that you're about to watch is written by an African-American Tijani Muslim. And it's from the show Rami.
The rules are very important in our faith, not for the reasons you might think. I was confused about this once too. By the grace of Allah, I found my teacher. She taught me that Islam is like an orange. There's an outer part and an inner part. If someone only got the rules and rituals, they might think Islam is tough and bitter, like the outside of an orange. But there's an inside, a juicy flesh, the divine intimacy, the spiritual experience. The rind without the flesh is bitter and useless. The flesh without the rind would quickly rot. The outer Sharia protects the inner spirituality, and the inner spirituality gives the outer Sharia its purpose and meaning. My teacher helped me understand that I needed both.
Oh, sorry. Try to move on to the next one. Okay. Actually, when I talked to the writer of this clip, he said that he wrote it after he had a conversation with his Tijani sheikh. All right. The systematic spread of Sufism in the form of Sufi orders and movements became firmly rooted in West Africa between the 18th and 20th centuries. Islam had already established a significant presence in the region, having entered North Africa in the 8th century. Today, Africans living south of the Sahara make up over 15% of the global Muslim population, with the Pew Research Center projecting a 60% increase in that number by 2030. While numerous Sufi paths and practices have emerged in sub-Saharan Africa, 3 orders have largely shaped the spiritual landscape of West Africa since the 19th century: the Qadiri order, the Tijani order, and the Murid order. And here we are talking about the Tijani order. Sorry, why it's doing this. Okay. Now I'll be reading from my essay. The Sufi American poet Baraka Blue arrived to speak at my Islamic Studies class at MCI Norfolk, Massachusetts' largest prison facility, wearing a long dark coat and a kufi cap. He had carefully draped a traditional Yemeni scarf over his right shoulder, and his long blonde hair was woven into a single thick braid. After undergoing processing and making it through the trap, a cylindrical high-ceiling chamber with curved doors on either side and an officer above, ensuring that the entrance was sealed before the exit unlocked, we stepped onto the prison grounds. Baraka Blue removed his kufi, pressed it to his chest, stood still, bowed his head, closed his eyes, and recited a prayer under his breath. Unaccustomed to a halt in movement in a place where I knew I was under close watch, my discomfort deepened with every passing second. But there he stood, unbothered by the watchtowers and barbed wire, unfazed by the sharpshooters overhead. A few moments later, he looked up and started walking again. I asked, "Are you okay?" He answered, "Our master, Malcolm, had a waking vision of the Prophet here. For him, this was a ziyarah, a spiritual pilgrimage," he explained. Malcolm X is a saint of the American Sufi tradition, and the prison where he'd had a prophetic vision was therefore considered holy ground. 6 years after Baraka Blue's prison ziyarah, I found myself sitting in the Langston Hughes Auditorium at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. I was attending an event organized by followers of the Tijani order. Although founded in Fez, Morocco by Ahmed al-Tijani, the expansion of the Tijani order in West Africa is attributed to this man, Ibrahim Niasse, who we've met previously. As we said before, the young Niasse started his training in Islamic studies early and excelled, and the Tijani order had been anticipating the arrival of a spiritual guide who would usher in an influx of followers, a prophecy declared about 100 years earlier by the order's founder. This influx was termed al-Fayda, the flood. And from very early in his life, it was clear that Ibrahim Niasse would be a strong contender for the role. And he sort of took on this role sometime between June 1929 and May 1930. First thousands and then millions of West African Muslims started following his path, and Niasse became an undeniable force on the world stage. This is an Arabic newspaper headline that reads, "Religious leader who has 8 million students." It's actually really hard to know how many Tijanis are present in the world today, but sort of the most conservative estimates put the Tijanis at around 100 million followers today. Ibrahim Niasse was active in local politics and frequently met with heads of state sorry, I don't know what's happening with my presentation. Frequently met with heads of state both as the vice president of the Muslim World League and as the leader of one of the largest faith communities in the region. He maintained the relationships with various Pan-African leaders, such as Gamal Abdel Nasser and Sekou Touré, and according to Wright, formed a particularly close friendship with Kwame Nkrumah, even visiting him in prison in the early 1950s. There are so many pictures of Ibrahim Niasse with Kwame Nkrumah. They were very, very close. And in fact, there's this interesting story where when Nkrumah was head of state and he was thinking about leaving town, Ibrahim Niasse has a dream. And in his dream, he's told that he sees this vision and he interprets it to mean that if Nkrumah leaves, there will be a coup and he'll never return. And so he sends one of his sons off to Ghana. He says, go tell Nkrumah about this. So he goes, and Nkrumah's like, I don't know what to do. This is my good friend telling me this. And so he asks one of his advisors, and he says, this is just a religious hullabaloo. Just ignore it. It's fine. He leaves, and of course, he never comes back to power. And after that, Senghor, who is the head of state in Senegal, starts to ask, where did this man get his information from? And uses the French surveillance apparatus to surveil Ibrahim Niasse and the Tijaniya. So that's how you kind of see the anti-colonial stuff coming in. Back in the auditorium, Sufi American poet Amir Suleiman takes to the stage. The first time I saw Amir Suleiman was in a YouTube video 19 years ago. He had been featured in season 4 of Russell Simmons' Deaf Poetry Jam, hosted by Mos Def, now known as Yassine Bey. At the start of the video, Mos Def's iconic voice reverberates over an opening graphic. From Rochester, New York, by way of Atlanta, please give it up for Amir Suleiman.
Rochester, New York, by way of Atlanta, please give it up for Amir Suleiman.
The graphic fades to reveal a tall Suleiman standing on a stage in a black shirt and kufi, sleeves rolled up, no prayer beads in sight. A look of defiance has settled into his face. His hands are clasped over his abdomen until his index finger begins to puncture the air. He recites the words with which he would become associated for years.
I am not angry, I am anger. I am not dangerous, I am danger. I am abominable stress, idiotic, relentless. I'm a breath of vengeance. I'm a death sentence. I'm forsaken repentance to the beast and his henchmen, armed forces and policemen. That survive off of oil and prisons of today. Cup one is over with lost souls.
I don't know how to move to the next one.
Dragging them into
Sorry, it's difficult to move between the slides for some reason. Okay. Nearly two decades older. Let me present this. Nearly 2 decades older, the Suleiman before me on the Schomburg stage, and this I made this video from being at the Schomburg, stands upright, arms resting at his sides, his expression caught between a willing surrender and a deep yearning. He begins his poems with allusions to esoteric verses of the Quran.
For he is the sun at noon. He is the kaf in the noon. He is the ba in the seen and unseen. He is a shoreless sea. He is a nightless day. He is the meaning for being with the angels we pray.
Suleiman then switches to Arabic, singing a litany of prophetic praise known as Salat al-Fatih, recited daily by millions of followers of the Tijani Sufi order around the world. The nearly 400 attendees in the Langston Hughes Auditorium, overwhelmingly African and African American, joined their voices to Suleiman's.
Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad al-Fatih lima uglika wal khatim lima sabakana surah haq bil haq wal hadi ila sarataka mustaqim wa ala ali haqqa qadrihi wa miqdal al-azim.
Suleiman's set lasts about 10 minutes. By the end of it, he is in such a state of rapture that his body trembles, his eyes wildly search the room for understanding, and his voice oscillates between octaves. He is a man in love. He begins his second poem with a lament. I gained your love and then I lost my mind. What a bargain. His words and state echo a long tradition of Sufi poets who tread the delicate boundary between sanity and madness in their devotion to God and the Prophet Muhammad. This lineage spans from America's best-selling poets, the 13th century Persian Jalaluddin Rumi, and to the progenitor of Suleiman's own order, you must all know him by now, Ibrahim Niasse, to protege of Allen Ginsberg and the Beat Poets, contemporary American poet Daniel Abdul-Hayy Moore. The two MCs that introduced Suleiman, a man and a woman, appear to be in their late 20s or early 30s, Aliya Abdurrauf and Haji Hassan. Both Hassan and Abdurrauf, we learn, are second-generation African-American followers of the Tijani order, raised between the US and Medina by Senegal. I had first met Hassan the previous evening when I'd reluctantly walked up to the large wooden door of his parents' brownstone on a quiet street in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bed-Stuy. Though sure I'd had the right address, the lights were off and there were no signs that anyone was home. I stood hesitant in the frigid December air. Was this the place? I looked back at the door for signs when I realized that one was literally staring back at me. The door knocker was a brass upside-down hamsa, also known as the Hand of Fatima, a palm-shaped talisman meant to ward off evil. In the middle of the palm was a single eye. This was definitely the place. I rang the doorbell. A strikingly beautiful older black woman opened the door. She held a phone to her ear with one hand and a doorknob with the other, looking as though she'd come in haste. I'm here for the wazifa, I told her. She pointed down and mouthed, downstairs, the door on the right. I nodded gratefully and went back down to the front steps and around the side of the house to the basement. I knocked, and when I heard no response, I gently pushed the door open. Shoes lined the entryway, a sure sign of any space of Muslim worship. I took off my boots and walked through the wood-paneled hallway toward the kitchen, where I could see 2 or 3 women setting up large foil containers of food on a table. I walked slowly, savoring the view of the hallway walls lined with art collectibles and photographs. In one frame, I don't know why this keeps doing this. In one frame was a black and white full-body photo of Ibrahim Niasse, standing tall in a cream aba and white turban. His image is surrounded by Arabic verses of his poetry. In another black and white photo, a congregation of 46 men and women and 1 child posed in front of a brick building with large glass windows. A banner with Arabic calligraphy hung over the front door. It featured half the Islamic Declaration of Faith at the top, there is no God but God, and the other half at the bottom, Muhammad is the messenger of God, and 2 crossed swords in the center. At the bottom of the photo, over the dark asphalt of the streets, 2 handwritten lines in white ink read, "The Uniting Islamic Society of America, First Convention, Philadelphia, August 18th, 1943. Later, I learned that the brick building was the YMCA at 1724 Christian Street in Philadelphia. The black and brown people in the photo were African American, South Asian, and Arab. The occasion was called the First Muslim and Arab Convention, and the 2 black men in the center, these 2, one wearing the jubba and the other with the suit and the jubba, were Saeed Akmal, who was born Walter Bellinger, and Nasser Ahmed, born Walter Smith Bey, both pioneers of the spread of Islam in America. Little is known about Bey's background. Bellinger, however, descends from a prominent black Pittsburgh family who had made their way north from South Carolina during the Great Migration. His older brother, Louis A.S. Bellinger, was a prominent African-American architect and a Republican candidate for Congress in the 1932 race. The younger Bellinger, who you can see here, served as president of the first Muslim mosque of Pittsburgh. According to historian of religious conversion in the US, Patrick Bowen, the initial steps toward founding the mosque that Akmal later led were taken in 1941 by a young Palestinian immigrant named Muhammad S. Jalajil. With the help of numerous African-American Muslim leaders, many of whom had first come to Islam through the Moorish Science Temple and the Ahmadi missionaries, the mosque was officially incorporated in 1945 and became an important gathering place for Sunni Muslims in the area. The convention commemorated in the photo had intended on uniting the budding Muslim community sprouting across the United States. The final photo that caught my eye on the wall is more recent and in color. It is of Haji Hassan's late father. This man's name is Imam Sayyid Abdus Salam. He's the first American man to join and become authorized as a muqaddam, or a representative of the Tijani order in the US. Rasul Miller and Samiha Rahman both write about this. Like many African American Muslims born in the mid-20th century, Abdus Salam's first conversion was through the Nation of Islam. And then he left the NOI in 1964 with the departure of Malcolm X. Rasul Miller, who is a historian of all of this, was actually present that night. And he had a conversation with me in which he told me that Abdus Salam was present at the first meeting of Malcolm X's Muslim Mosque, Inc. This community, tells me Rasul Miller, carries the legacy of what Malcolm X began. And with some of the other things that you see in the place, you clearly can tell that this Bed-Stuy home is seen as the continuation, the Sufi continuation of the project started by Malcolm. I later learned that the woman who had greeted me at the door upstairs is Sister Naja Abdus Salam, whose quote we started the second part of this presentation with. And she has been hosting these weekly gatherings at their Bed-Stuy home since the mid-2000s. So the next day, I went to the Schomburg. I arrived early as they instructed me to, and people had already sort of gathered there. I was chatting with some of the women at the door, asking them where they come from, and it was from every city: Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, Toronto, Detroit, Cleveland, everywhere. All but one of the women that I spoke with that night were either African American or African, predominantly African American. Standing in that lobby, I could not help but think, of the March 1925 special issue of Survey Graphic, edited by Elaine Locke with contributions from the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois and Arturo Schomburg. It is titled Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro. Could they have imagined, architects of the Harlem Renaissance, leaders of Pan-African congresses, conservers of a Negro past, how every word of that subtitle would draw new air and breathe fresh life through these black Sufi lungs? Every Mecca demands a pilgrimage. There's a lot to say about this gathering, but I'm going to limit myself to one thing and let you read the rest in the essay. This gathering was a commemoration honoring Hassan Cisse, who was Ibrahim Nias's grandson and one of his spiritual heirs. He was the one to bring the message of the Tijani order to the US and specifically to African Americans. In 1983, Sheikh Hassan established a school in Medina by Senegal. The school is called the African American International Institute Legacy Academy. Since its founding, the school has educated hundreds of Black American Muslim students, including the first known Black American Muslim woman to have memorized the entire Quran in Arabic. In a fascinating article on the relationships between Africans and African American Tijani disciples in Medina Bay, Samiha Rahman writes that it was a woman, in fact, who had served as the impetus for the institute's founding. Hajja Karima Abdul Karim from the Bronx tells Rahman that after visiting Medina Bay twice, she wrote an 8-page letter to Hassan Cisse, urging him to open a school for African American children. Moved by the way the Tijani disciples lived and learned, she wanted her own children to have the same opportunity. She proposed a tuition of no more than $200 a month, and Cisse agreed. As a result, the majority of African Americans who attended the institute, writes Rahman, came from working-class Black families and often struggled with the payments. To keep the school running, Cisse heavily subsidized it from his own finances. When locals questioned why he would dedicate so many personal resources to the project, Rahman reports that Cisse defended his decision, calling it a form of reparations owed to African Americans by their African sisters and brothers. Thus, writes Rahman, Sheikh Hassan's diasporic consciousness enabled a predominantly working-class community to participate in international travel and study abroad, opportunities that were often inaccessible to economically marginalized Black people in the urban USA. Very briefly, there's another really interesting interview in which this African-American woman is asked, why did you join the Tijaniya? She was part of the Black Power movement in the US. And she said, you know, my whole life I had been told that we were kidnapped and taken from Africa. And I always asked myself, why hasn't anyone come looking for us if we were kidnapped? And Hassan Cisse would spend all of his time in these kind of urban communities, Black communities in the US. And she said that when she saw him, she thought to herself, someone has finally come to get us back. I'd like to end with Sukaina Noor, the poet who had performed alongside Suleiman at the Schomburg. She's a regular speaker at Tijani programs. Noor, who is Jamaican British from Easton and Bristol, converted to Islam in 2005. Like other poets of the English Sufi poetic tradition, such as Baraka Blue, who was white and American from Seattle, Washington, Amir Suleiman, who was Black American from Rochester, New York, Noor's early influences stem from the Black arts movement in the US and the broader diaspora. The Black radical tradition features heavily in all their journeys, with one expectedly towering figure at its center, Malcolm X. Noor had started her set at the Schomburg as is customary in the name of God, Bismillah, and with a litany of prophetic praise. But in her short 3-minute and 30-second set, her poetry encapsulated what I had come to understand as the essence and the appeal of the Tijani way, especially for African Americans. The chance to be stripped of any imposed identity or essentialized self, leaving only an awestruck creation ready to come in ripped jeans and a giant's jersey, a grand bubu and Hausa cap, hoop earrings and a milfu, in English, Arabic, French, or Wolof, into the light of the Creator. She began with the Arabic vocative particle, ya, a call to the bringer of the flood that has burst out of Africa and spilled onto the shores of its diaspora. As every Tijani gathering ends with poetry and prophetic praise, here too, the poet has the final say. On the stage of that auditorium, named for the jazz poet of the weary blues, wrapped in a blue hijab and embroidered blue abaya, reminiscent of Malcolm's Agbada in Nigeria, Sukaina Noor recites.
Ya Sheikh Ibrahim, you gave me an appetite for annihilation.
Taught me to leave my ego at the bottom of the stairs and come. Taught me everything in this dunya is fading except the one, even my own existence. So leave that too and come. You taught me the wealth of having nothing and the poverty in having everything. You taught me to forget my own name, then taught me my real name. Showed me how to seek God's face on the horizon and within myself. Now I know myself and speak from a tongue that makes no empty claims, a tongue that talks only from taste.
Thank you.
Professor Brown, you start us off, please.
Yeah, well, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. As we knew it would be. No surprise there. One of the things I'm interested in, one of the things that I think makes this work and this project so interesting is that you see that that the way in which you're characterizing these movements and their relationship to each other is not black in an identitarian sense.
Right.
And you're quite explicit to say, like, look, they're transnational, they are faithful. There's, yeah, there are all kinds of things going on that are not reducible to black identitarian movements.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's very clear that as a symbolic value, blackness is everywhere within these movements. And I wonder if you would characterize how blackness works symbolically, even if black people don't define the heart of this movement.
Yeah, I think maybe blackness is not what at the heart of these movements. It's Africanness in some ways. It's a little looser with the Muslim Brothers because, you know, they have this larger kind of pan-Islamist idea that, you know, whether you're African or not, but they happen to be situated, you know, they are on the African continent. And they are dealing with people like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is talking about Pan-Africanism and is constantly engaging in those conversations. So you're asking, like, how does this still come out despite the fact that there are other ways in which they're connected, right?
What I'm noticing is that there's nothing exclusively black about the movements you're talking about.
Right.
Like, very clearly.
Yeah.
And yet, blackness as a symbolic value seems to be mobilized, and maybe it's Africanness and not blackness.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you think that Africanness is at the heart of it,
Yeah.
I would say, what role for blackness has symbolic value, even in a movement that's organized around Africanness?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't seem that in this movement that emerges also alongside negritude, right?
Exactly.
That it could be kind of excluded from or very distinct from characterizations of blackness and the role of Africanity within that. I'm just asking you to kind of talk about the relationship a little bit. Talk about how blackness works as value, if it does, within these movements, even though there's nothing exclusive about them.
Yeah. I think the way it works, I'll take the Tijaniya, for example, because we're on it right now. But I think the way it works with the Tijaniya is there is a strong sort of black is beautiful, black pride sensibility within the Tijaniya, which I think is why it appeals so much to African Americans more than other Sufi movements, more than other Muslim political social movements. And so Ibrahim Niasse in his writings constantly does bring up this idea of, you know, we are proud to be black, but that's not the essence of who we are. Who we are is creation. So he speaks to it because of this. I think there's this general idea within Sufism that the Sufi is a child of their time, as in the Sufi is a child of their context. And so Ibrahim Niasse recognizes that in the context that he is in, it's important to actually affirm blackness in a world that negates it. And that's what sort of negritude's big move is, so an affirmation of blackness in a world that constantly denies it and negates it. But he doesn't want to make the move that negritude does, which, Wole Soyinka, for example, then criticizes or critiques to say that, like, you've made blackness so essentialized that now I have a problem. Then I have a problem with calling myself black if that's how you're going to conceive of it. So Ibrahim Niasse says, no, blackness needs to be affirmed in this contextual moment. Is it who we are primordially? No. And it's important for you to see both of those things. I think a good way to also kind of think of this is in some of the conversations that happen within the study of religion. So Charles Long, who's a black scholar, writes about how part of what he sees as the problem, or part of what he sees in the way he characterizes white supremacy, is to say that white supremacy has become this mysterium tremendum, which is within the study of religion. The mysterium tremendum is the way that God is characterized. You meet this grand kind of essence that you don't understand how, you cannot understand its greatness, and you fathom your inability to understand that greatness. And so you see yourself as like too small to take it on, right? And Charles Long takes that and he says for black people, they experience two mysterium tremendums. They experience the mysterium tremendum of the divine, and then they experience the mysterium tremendum of white supremacy once they got on the slave ships. And suddenly they're like, this is too big for me to handle. And then Sherman Jackson, who's a black Muslim scholar, comes in and says, actually, Charles Long, I think you're right, and I think part of the problem is that the second mysterium tremendum has veiled people from the first mysterium tremendum. And what we need to do as black religionists is to take away that mysterium tremendum of whiteness, situate it in its place to say, no, it cannot be as large as the divine, and look past it to be able to see the divine. I think Ibrahim Niasse is doing something like that when he's kind of taking on a program of black affirmation in this particular moment.
That's very helpful, thank you.
First of all, fire, Mafaz, as always. That was incredible. I had a question about, you had mentioned at one point the amount of Muslims in Africa is set to rise by 60% or something like that by 2030.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, like, what's the sort of dialect? Because, like, here we see the very Pan-African and diasporic ways that Islam sort of travels. And I'm wondering, like, what's the dialectic of forces, if you know, to your knowledge, like, in our current moment, that would create a rise by 60% on the continent right now? And also, is that matched here or in other, like, in the diaspora, like in other places, is Islam set to rise among Africans or black people and things like that? So I guess, like, a continuation of this sort of tradition that we're seeing, and also other forces across the world that are kind of influencing this 60% rise. I was curious.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Kojo. So part of it is demographic. It's just a demographic rise. People are having a lot of babies in certain parts. And so you have that naturally. But also, through these Sufi orders, not just the Tijani, but the Murid order as well, and the Qadri order, there's people are sort of being drawn to being part of that social fabric that's like huge, right? You go to Medina Bai, and it's everybody there is not just Muslim, but they're Tijani and they're Sufi, and their entire social life revolves around that. So, the conversion in those places becomes quite natural. In the US, Islam has been for many, many years the fastest growing religion in Islam, and especially amongst African Americans. It's particularly in prisons. Islam is the fastest growing religion in prisons. And that's mostly due to the work that the Nation of Islam started in American prisons. So, I mean, you are seeing a growth. I don't know that I can speak to why it's happening. I have some theories and hypotheses, but I'm not like super familiar with any kind of social sciencey work that's been done there.
Professor.
Mafaz, that was a totally fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. What I'm curious about is, I mean, it's vast. So is there anything left in your thesis?
That's a good question. Yes, so my broader, this is actually just chapter 1. So, but the second part that you saw that's about, the Muslims in Philadelphia, none of that is in my work. That's just in the Transition magazine essay that Tanya is going to publish, so everybody should pick up Transition magazine. So that all of that is not in my work, but it's not in my work.
It's not going to be in your thesis?
No. None of the stuff that's about Harlem and Brooklyn and all of that's not in my thesis at all. I stop
Why not?
I have to stop somewhere, and I stop in 1975. And that marks the death of both Ibrahim Niasse and Elijah Muhammad, mostly because I do not want to engage with Louis Farrakhan. And so I would like to stop there.
Do we have any idea how many African Americans have migrated to Medina Bay?
So they don't stay. What they do is these families send their children. So I know at least four or five families myself, young people my age who have young children, who are sending their children off to Medina Bay. They go with them, they drop them off, and then they leave. And they leave them there in a boarding school. And they're there for anywhere between a year to their entire elementary and middle school years. And then usually they come back in high school so that they can complete the American educational system, and get the proper certification and whatnot. But they always plan on coming back to America. They don't plan on staying. So the idea is they send their children, they become formed as subjects in Medina Bay, and then they return. One of the people there in her remarks was saying, she said, I was sent to Medina Bay really young. I came back, and all my friends, there were like these rappers and basketball stars and that they all knew, and they were their heroes. And she said, I knew them, but they were not my heroes. My heroes were in Medina Bay. My heroes were spiritual dignitaries. And so they go back, they live in the communities, they know what's going on, but they're kind of just sent there to be formed in that young age.
I ask because this is apropos of nothing really, but we had African Literature Association annual meeting in Senegal in my early years here. So it was in the early 90s, right? So I get on the boat to go over to Gorée, and I'd been there before, and just sort of an outing. And there was a woman fully, I don't know what the proper term was, but she
Covered,
was Muslim, yeah. And she just walked up to me and said, "Hi, Skip." And it was Tony Brown, who was my classmate at Yale.
What?
Yeah, in the class 73, who had, and then I was so amazed that I tried to hug her, and she goes, "No, you can't hug me. I love you, but you can't hug me. And maybe we could hook up later in Dakar or something." But we were all going to Ousmane Sembène's house for this big feast, and it never worked out. And I never could figure out what the hell Tony was doing in Dakar. And I didn't know if maybe this was one way, if I wanted to find out badly enough, I could find out through the Yale alumni office. And maybe I will now. But I just wondered if there were regular lines of transmission of human beings back and forth.
Yeah.
That would get Tony from Harlem to Dakar.
So interestingly, you all remember what a ziyara is, right? It's a spiritual pilgrimage. There is a yearly ziyara in July of Tijanis who go from wherever they are, whether the US or the UK or Australia, or wherever they are, to Medina Bay. And it's organized by Black Americans, a Black American woman, actually. So every year, this...
Is her name Tony Brown? Was her name Tony Brown?
But I mean, to that point, when I visited, when I spent time with them in Harlem, I would meet people, and I'd realize that I was talking to some of my favorite academics, and I'm like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And the woman said to me, "Well, I'm Tijani. I'm here for the ziyara." You know, and it is, you know, it's not a secret. People don't hide it, but I think a lot of us just don't know to ask about it.
So Sufi is spiritual movements. You could be Sunni and Sufi at the same time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I love it. I think it's great.
exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Questions, comments?
Thank you for this fascinating, sweeping account of what you call Muslim counterculture. For the little story, one of Ibrahim Nias's daughters was actually married to the most prominent Tijani sheikh in Niger. He died about 10 years ago.
Oh, wow, okay, yeah.
He was the sort of, you know, prominent religious leader in the country. So women are also important to that story, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So my question has more to do, I mean, you gave us a really interesting sense of how Nias connected with other sort of visionaries, whether they were political figures or religious figures in West Africa. But what was his connection or his relationships or absence of relationship to, in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood? Because a lot of Senegalese students, you know, went to Egypt and, of course, Sudan and elsewhere. I mean, this is where you got your religious education, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So what was his vision of what was happening, you know, in Egypt?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really good question because, as you know, Gamal Abdel Nasser had a very contentious relationship with the Muslim Brothers and imprisoned them, tortured them, and Ibrahim Nias told him that. He said, "I think you're treating them wrong. I think that, you know, this is a movement that should be given a shot like any other movement does in Egypt. What is it about them that is particularly bothersome to you?" So he knew the Muslim Brothers. He had good relations with them, and he explicitly called out Abdel Nasser, and on his treatment of the Muslim Brothers. So I mean, Ibrahim Nias was quite diplomatic in a lot of his relations, but he was not afraid to kind of speak his mind. Interestingly, on this idea that you know, people go, a lot of Senegalese students go to Egypt to study at Al-Azhar, for example. Hassan Cisse, who became the big Tijani sheikh in the US, Hassan Cisse had gone to Egypt, studied at Ain Shams University, got a degree in, I believe, comparative English literature at Ain Shams University. Studied in the UK, came back, and he had gotten an offer to continue his studies in Libya. And he tells Sheikh Ibrahim, he says, "Oh, I got this scholarship to go study in Libya," and he says, "What should I do?" And Sheikh Ibrahim says, "Well, you know, you could go to Libya and continue to speak in Arabic and Wolof and Hausa and speak to the people you already speak to, or you could go to the US and you could learn English." And you could spend time with people who have not had any of us go speak with them. And so he actually came to the US. He came to New York first. He spent time in kind of local communities, but then he started a PhD in Islamic studies at Northwestern University. A few years into him starting the PhD, his father, Ali Cisse, dies in Senegal, and he's sort of called back to take on the mantle of the Tijaniya in Senegal. So he stops his PhD and he returns to Senegal. But he was kind of seen as the English-speaking sheikh. Some of the Senegalese Tijanis would call him the American sheikh, even though he was born and raised in Senegal.
Mafaz, this was a great talk, so thanks. And I was really impressed that one could bring Malcolm X, Jairus Banerjee, and Julius Scott into the same frame. It was really, really rich.
That is a testimony to how wonderful my interlocutors are.
I can see that. So, I was really compelled by the intervention that one needed to see the emergence of these movements in the post-World War I moment in relationship to the longue durée of colonialism and capitalism. And I just wanted to invite you to reflect for a moment on the stakes in that methodological choice. Why does it matter to look at something concretely like this post-World War I moment or conjuncture, as you term it, and the longue durée?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's important because there is a temptation when looking at groups like this that are sort of deemed as outer culture, very weird, different, to think of them as spontaneously arising from some kind of strong, usually emotional reaction, right? So the Nation of Islam, right, becomes like the group of that's all about hate. The Muslim Brothers becomes the group that's all about power and hate. The Tijanis become like all about power and deceiving the simple African mind. Right? Like they're very easily dismissed in these ways, and I'm putting it in a very crude way, but you hear it in less crude ways in the scholarship of very good scholars, and I think what's at stake. That's kind of precisely what's at stake is. This idea that we see them as spontaneous emergences, and people end up doing this kind of, this is about theology, this is about ontology, right? This is about like them being the civilizational other as though that has no like historical and material economic explanations. So that's what, but I would love to invite you to make more of a comment on that move. At lunch.
Hi, Mafaz.
Hi,
No,
Martha.
this was really, really fascinating. I just had a quick question about women in these movements and the extent to which they're transforming them, and do you see kind of countercultures within the counterculture? And so I was hoping you could speak more about that and the extent to which these groups are evolving and in response to demands of women for a greater voice within them.
Yeah, thank you. So I had this whole part, but I had to skip it because of time. On the women in the Tijaniya, specifically at this event that I went to in Harlem. And at this event, they honored like the great people, and every year they honor a few people who are present. And two of the people who are honored, one was the oldest midwife in America, who is a Muslim woman, who started this group called Moms. I think it's Midwives on the Move, Mom. And she has kind of doing this transnational midwifery work between Senegal and the US. So she's like birthing Senegalese babies and African American babies, like some crazy number in the hundreds. And so they honored her. And then the other person they honored is Hajja Ashaki Cisse. And Hajja Ashaki is a white American woman who is one of the highest in the sort of hierarchy of Tijaniya today. And she's a muqaddam, so Hassan Cisse made her a muqaddam, a representative of the Tijaniya. So in terms of like the order, there's really no one higher than what she would have as Hajja Ashaki Cisse. And it's interesting, in my essay I talk about how on any American census she would check white. But in this gathering, she's Tijani. So that just goes away. And so to some degree also, a little bit of the gender stuff goes away because she's a muqaddam. So they defer to her. Doesn't matter, she's a man or woman, she's being deferred to with certain things. Ibrahim Nias's daughter, Sheikha Maryam Nias, was the founder of the Quranic Islamic school systems in Senegal. And so there's like hundreds of schools that she has started. And she's quite honored in both the African and the Arab world. So, I mean, it's different with every movement. When the Muslim Brothers were founded, the Muslim Sisters were founded as well within the movement. So you have very prominent people like Zainab al-Ghazali, who was imprisoned by Abdel Nasser, tortured by Abdel Nasser, who was big in the movement. But the younger generation, and the same thing in the Nation of Islam, of course, you have Clara Muhammad, and then later when Imam Warith ad-Din takes over, all the schools become the Clara Muhammad schools. And so they're kind of, you can kind of see a bit of a pattern that they're set in the educational realm a lot of the time, but in the Tijaniya specifically, very highly in the spiritual kind of realm as well, spiritual authority realm as well. But yeah, I mean, they're all responding, I think, as time goes to the push that comes within, not just, I would say, not just from women, but from young people in the movement generally. So men and women who want to see more women involved. Yeah.
I didn't catch your reference to the NAACP. Remember?
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't come back to, Abby just said, did she come back to the NAACP? What the hell's the NAACP doing in here? Roy Wilkins converted when we didn't know it, right?
So the idea behind the bringing up the NAACP, and I swear to God, I knew. When I put it in, I was like, somebody's going to bring something up for the NAACP. No, it's good. So the part of my work that I'm still trying to refine a little bit is these groups' relationships. We can talk about their relationship with the state, right? Which is like a very obvious way to talk about them. But I think a more interesting way to think of how they fit into this larger sensibility of secular liberalism is to also think about how those who wanted the same goals that they wanted still looked at them and said, you're weird. You're doing it weird. We're not supposed to do it this way. We're supposed to do it in this liberal political way. Whatever you're doing is not translatable to us. And so for the Tijanis, it would be Senghor. For the Muslim Brothers, it would be Abdel Nasser, and for the NOI, it would be the kind of the larger civil rights movement that's looking at them and being like, don't do all of that stuff, right? Stop doing that thing. So I'm still building out those parts of the dissertation, but that's the general idea of why I would bring up the NAACP.
The civil rights movement thought that they were a joke, or
a
fraud, or a...
That's the point.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's like, why? I wonder why they thought they were a joke and a fraud when they were a huge movement that was building economic power. And I'm not saying they were right. If I thought they were right, I would join them. But I'm not in any of these groups. But
Mayor Daley had Elijah Muhammad Day.
Yeah. Right. So you have some of them. Yeah.
But on the other hand, Mayor Daley had Elijah Muhammad Day.
Yeah.
Recognizing their political power.
Yeah.
So what I said, I didn't mean to generalize it that way, but certainly by the March on Washington, nobody was taking Elijah Muhammad seriously. They weren't going to have the big six, the big seven, right?
Right.
With Elijah Muhammad there.
Yeah. So I'm trying to understand what is it that makes them so, in a way, so different, but also perceived as so dangerous to the power of the movement.
Well, Muhammad Ali's conversion, and then later Kareem's conversion, though he wasn't in the Nation of Islam, Kareem, that did a lot to change the image of the Nation of Islam, both within the black community and in the larger American community, I believe.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. And also, I think Malcolm's rhetoric changed, some of that I think changed as well. Some of the reception of the Nation of Islam changed as well.
Yeah, but Malcolm was 1959. He's on CBS with Mike Wallace. 1965 February. He's dead. So
he has very limited
time
to do it. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he lived on through the autobiography and becomes a poster.
Right.
required text in Black Studies departments, which start in 68, 69. But it's a funny kind of
And
sainthood that he achieves, you know?
Yeah, I think someone who is severely understudied in the later period after what I'm writing about is W.D. Muhammad, so Warithuddin Muhammad, Imam W.D. Muhammad, because I think if I were to isolate the larger the black Muslims from the larger kind of context, without W.D. Muhammad, we don't know if Islam would have been a purely immigrant phenomenon in America.
But didn't he just disappear?
No, that's Farad Muhammad. That's Wallace Farad Muhammad who founded it. I'm talking about Elijah's son. Warithuddin.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
Warithuddin Muhammad.
Right. Who became, quote unquote, a real Muslim.
Who became a kind of orthodox, embraced Orthodox Sunni Islam.
Yeah.
But interestingly, today, Louis Farrakhan is advised, one of his advisors is a man by the name of Ahmed Tijani, who is part of the Tijani order. Who is like, yes, we're different, we have different theological commitments, whatever, but we're both black, we're both Muslim in some sense, and I should still, you should have some kind of access to Muslims on the continent. So he is an advisor to Farrakhan today.
Well, quickly, when we talk about the prisoners, the percentage of prisoners converting, what percentage of them are converting to the Nation of Islam?
Very low.
Very low.
Very low. So Nation of Islam followers in American prisons are quite, it's a very low percentage. Very low percentage. It's mostly converting to Sunni Islam, or Orthodox Sunni Islam. Really quick side note, I just remembered because you said the name Kareem. Elijah Muhammad was initially not called Elijah Muhammad. Of course, we know he was Elijah Poole, born Elijah Poole. But when he met Wallace Farad Muhammad, and when he met him, sometimes people make that story to seem like these two, like this young Elijah Muhammad meets this guy and is brainwashed by him or something. But actually, it was already a big movement when Elijah Muhammad that's how he hears about Wallace Farad Muhammad. He hears from the other people working the railroad. And he was super depressed. He was out of a job, and he was an alcoholic. He goes and he meets Wallace Farad Muhammad and becomes one of his followers. Eventually, he kind of spends a lot of time with him, and Wallace Farad Muhammad says to him, "You are going to be like kind of the next leader." And he gives him the name, initially when he first joins the movement, he gives him the name Elijah Kareem. So his name was initially Elijah Kareem. After he spends time with Farad Muhammad, and as Farad Muhammad knew he was going to be disappeared, he gives him a final parting gift by giving him his last name, Muhammad. So he becomes Elijah Muhammad. But initially it was Elijah Kareem.
Treat to hear not only the development of your thinking, but to see your work presented in this form. My question was around, you had a comment toward the end when you switched to your Ziyara essay about how these Tijaniya gatherings are the sort of spiritual successors of Malcolm. Or excuse me, my question was, when you say that they're the sort of upkeepers of, Malcolm's tradition, are you speaking politically? Because that didn't strike me as you making a claim about their politics. And if so, if you're speaking spiritually, then I'm wondering, because it seems to me that we sort of famously don't know much about Malcolm's inner spiritual life, and we just know more of him as a political figure.
Yeah.
So what are these people drawing on to say that we're keeping a tradition alive of Malcolm if it's in a spiritual realm? And then how might that draw out Malcolm's spirituality for us as rehearsed through their sort of practice of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're right, we don't know a lot about Malcolm's, we have some things from the autobiography. The part that Baraka Blue is referring to is, of course, a reference to the autobiography where Malcolm sees a waking vision of what he thinks is Wallace Farad Muhammad. but later reinterprets, or people reinterpret it for him as possibly the Prophet Muhammad, which is why this now becomes a site of sacred ground, because a saint has seen a waking vision of the Prophet there. So we have some kind of things like that from early in Malcolm's life. Later, we do know that he comes under the tutelage of a Sudanese Sufi, or a Sudanese sheikh, and that he meets with a lot of the Sufi sheikhs. So we know that Malcolm is aware, at least, of this world. And Imam Sayyid Abdus Salam, having been around Malcolm, being there at the first meeting of the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, we don't know what he sort of took from him, but I will tell you that in that house, there's an image, I wish I could have had it to show. There's a large poster of Malcolm standing there, and all around him, this is a painting, all around him are kind of these floating images of people from the African diasporic tradition who are not Muslim and people who are Muslim. So you have Marcus Garvey there. You have Omar ibn Sayyid there. But you also have Ibrahim Niass there. You also have Malik Sy there. And at the center of this is Malcolm. And in that image, Malcolm is looking down at other images of himself, all the way down to an image of him standing in prayer in Egypt. And that kind of artistic rendition is usually made for a saint to look down at their different selves. And so they're already creating this kind of idea around Malcolm as the spiritual guide of this movement. So these groups are not apolitical. It's not like, oh, don't participate in politics or something. But they're primarily spiritual. And so I think that they're taking it, I don't know what they took from Malcolm through Imam Abdus Salam, but at the bottom of that image that I just described to you, it says something like dedicated to the Imam, who is the something like the holder of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabaz's way. So they're really seeing themselves as is within that tradition. Yeah.
Wait, one more question?
Yes, one. Thank you.
Thanks, Vince.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So we can have a Muslim barbecue. I can't wait to see what kind of barbecue we got.
If there's pork, it really will be tragic.
I want one order of pork.
Mafaz, thanks very much for your presentation today.
Thank you, Harry.
2 brief questions. On your founders page, you don't depict Wallace Fard Muhammad, but depict Elijah Muhammad. I was wondering why.
Yeah.
And 2, where does the 5% Nation of Islam fit into this analysis of Muslim countercultures?
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I don't study the 5%ers, but I would hope that someone would study them maybe within a similar framework.
What are the 5%ers?
To my knowledge, they're an offshoot of the Nation of Islam. I'm not as up on the name of the founder again, but I know that in hip hop, they've had a very pronounced effect, both in terms of numbers. Anytime you see someone in hip hop who is a Muslim or connected to Islam, they are probably a 5%er.
Like Jay-Z, right?
Jay-Z is not.
I thought he was.
No, but the members of Brand Nubian, for example, are.
Well, what's the 5% stand?
I think the general idea is that there are 100% of the people in the world, a certain number are completely ignorant, blind, deaf, and dumb. There's some who are aspiring to knowledge, and then there are 5% who are illuminated and knowledgeable.
Oh, I got it.
And they see themselves as that group with the light of knowledge, you might say.
Cut it down. They've made it even more limited.
Everybody's an elite in somebody's analysis, right?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't know enough about the 5%ers, or I mean, I know a little bit about the Moorish Science Temple because they're predecessors to a precursor to the Nation of Islam. But I would hope that somebody kind of thinks of them, studies them in that way.
Is there a reason you don't go that far, or you just haven't considered them, or you don't?
It's because I have to end my dissertation somewhere, and graduate, and not write a 1,000-page book.
Look, it's 3 volumes already. Why not add a 4th?
Thank you, Mafaz.
Yeah, and to your first question about the founders, because Wallace Farad Muhammad is we know so little about this man. All we really have about him is his FBI file, which is very interesting if you want to read it. I mean, it's like, was he, all the different theories of where he was from, who he was.
But why not a picture, in other words, I'm just saying.
Oh, I mean, we have one picture of him, it's super unclear, but I really don't, I don't really spend a lot of time on him because what becomes important politically in the political and social formation of the Nation of Islam is what Elijah Muhammad brings. So his writings, and Muhammad Speaks, his writings on time, you know, his writings on food and what people should eat, like all of that
becomes. And his raising of Malcolm X, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. So it becomes he far outshadows, like whatever the word is, Wallace Farad Muhammad, he becomes,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, barbecue time. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I'm so proud of you.